Right now, as you're sitting there listening to this, you probably feel pretty grounded.
Yeah, totally normal feeling.
Right, like you can feel the air in the room or maybe the weight of your body against a chair or the ground under your feet. It all feels very solid and, continuous.
It does, but the reality is a lot weirder.
It really is because you doing the listening right now, the thing processing these words, is actually just a series of microscopic electrical storms.
Yeah.
And they're locked inside this pitch black bone vault.
That is, I mean, it's kind of a terrifying way to put it, but it's completely accurate.
Right. So today we are doing a deep dive into the ultimate control center of the human body, which is the nervous system. Our mission today is to figure out how this master network operates under normal conditions, what happens when it, breaks down from the inside, and how foreign chemicals can completely hijack its machinery.
And it really shifts your perspective, I think, when you realize that every single breath, every memory, every conscious thought you have is entirely dependent on this incredibly fragile biological grid. We are essentially walking fiber optic networks.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even start talking about how the system fails or how it gets hacked, we need to map out the actual hardware.
Right, the baseline.
Exactly. So we know there's a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system.
Yeah.
If we stick to that fiber optic network analogy, the central nervous system, or CNS, that's basically the main server tower, right?
That's a really solid way to look at it. The CNS is the absolute command center. It's made up of the brain, and specifically we're talking about the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, along with the spinal cord.
And the spinal cord is like what, the main cable?
Exactly. It's this massive trunk cable dropping down from the executive office, routing all the critical data to the rest of the body.
But, a server tower is completely useless if it's not connected to any external devices. It needs to receive data and send out commands. So I'm guessing that's where the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, comes into play.
You got it. The PNS branches out from that central trunk cable into literally every single corner of your body. And it actually operates through two distinct divisions.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have the sensory division. Think of this as your massive, real-time intelligence-gathering network.
So this is pulling in data.
Right. It pulls data from your external sense organs, like your eyes and skin, and your internal organs, and it just constantly streams that telemetry up to the brain.
Okay, and once the brain processes that intelligence, it uses the second division, which is the motor division.
Exactly. This is the action arm of the network.
So it carries the execution orders out to the muscles, internal organs, the glands. And it's not just, voluntary stuff like me deciding to reach for my microphone.
Yeah. No, not at all. It's handling all the involuntary background processes, too, like keeping your heart beating or digesting your breakfast while you're not even thinking about it.
Now, all of this communication relies on these bundles of nerve cells called neurons. And they're firing incredibly fast electrical signals back and forth, right? The nerve impulses.
Yes, millions of them every second.
So here's where my understanding of the wiring sort of hits a snag.
Okay, let's hear it.
If these impulses are purely electrical, I imagine these neurons are just fused together like copper wire in a house, right? Just a continuous hardwired circuit.
You would think they'd be hardwired. It makes logical sense. But they actually aren't.
Wait, really?
Really, and that physical separation is actually the genius of the entire system. Neurons don't touch at all.
So there's a gap.
Yeah, these incredibly microscopic empty spaces between them. They're called synapses.
If these signals are purely electrical, how do they actually cross the physical empty spaces between neurons? Without a physical bridge.
It translates. The electrical signal travels down the neuron at lightning speed, but you're right, it cannot spark across that physical synapse on its own.
So what happens? Does it just stop?
No, when the electrical impulse reaches the absolute end of the neuron, it triggers the release of chemical messengers. These are called neurotransmitters.
Oh, so it shifts mediums, goes from electrical to chemical.
Exactly. Think of neurotransmitters as like tiny chemical ferries. They launch from the end of the first neuron, float across the fluid in the synapse, and physically dock into these perfectly shaped receptors on the next neuron.
That is wild.
And the moment they dock, they trigger a brand new electrical impulse in that receiving cell, and the signal just continues down the line.
So it goes from electrical to chemical, back to electrical in what, fractions of a millisecond?
Yep. Incredibly fast.
But why not just keep it electrical? That seems like adding a totally unnecessary middleman. Why risk a ferry crossing?
Because a purely electrical grid is an all-or-nothing system. If it were just electricity, A single stimulus like stubbing your toe could trigger an uncontrollable electrical chain reaction across your entire body.
Oh, like a power surge.
Exactly. By forcing the signal to cross a chemical gap, the body gains volume control. The brain can release excitatory chemicals to amplify the signal or inhibitory chemicals to dampen it.
So it can essentially decide how important the message is.
Right. This highly controlled electrical chemical grid is what allows for everything from precise muscle balance to high-level thinking and reasoning.
It's the physical manifestation of who we are,
Yeah.
which is honestly terrifying when you realize how easily that perfect chemical balance can be devastated.
It is very fragile.
Yeah. Let's move from the baseline into internal malfunction, specifically infectious diseases. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
You just described this incredibly delicate network, and we know the central part of it is locked inside a hard, bony vault, the skull and the spinal column.
Yes. Nature's armor.
Right. So if it's completely sealed in bone, how do viruses or bacteria manage to penetrate and cause such extreme emergencies?
What's fascinating here is that the armor itself actually becomes part of the trap.
What do you mean?
Well, the brain isn't sitting in a vacuum. It requires a massive, continuous blood supply to function. So pathogens, certain viruses and bacteria, can sometimes bypass the body's initial immune firewalls in the bloodstream and just ride that blood right over into the central nervous system.
Oh, so they use the supply lines.
Exactly. And when they do, you get diseases like encephalitis, which is an infection of the actual brain tissue itself,
Yikes.
or meningitis, which is an infection of the membrane surrounding the brain and spinal cord.
But, I mean, an infection usually just means swelling, right?
Yeah.
If I sprain my ankle, it puffs up, I ice it, and it's fine. It heals.
Right. But an ankle has room to expand into the surrounding air. The brain does not. It is entirely encased in solid bone. The skull doesn't stretch. So when a localized infection causes the brain or the surrounding membranes to inflame, the tissue expands outward, hits the bone, and then the pressure has literally nowhere to go but inward.
It crushes itself.
It literally crushes its own delicate neural pathways. This is why encephalitis and meningitis cause severe headaches, extremely high fevers, and can lead to fatal brain swelling so rapidly. They are absolute medical emergencies.
And with meningitis specifically, the sources note there's that one unique telltale symptom, right? A stiff neck.
Yes, that's a classic red flag.
If the membranes covering the spinal cord become highly inflamed, physically bending the neck stretches those inflamed tissues, causing severe rigidity and pain.
Exactly. You physically can't touch your chin to your chest.
Thankfully, while many of these internal malfunctions can't really be proactively stopped, we do have a viral meningitis vaccine available for children as young as 2 years old, which is a massive preventative shield.
It's a crucial medical advancement for sure. But infectious invaders aren't the only threat from within. Sometimes the hardware itself just short circuits.
You mean like epilepsy?
Yeah, take epilepsy, for example. We define nerve impulses as highly controlled electrical signals. Well, a seizure is essentially a period of abnormal, entirely uncontrolled electrical activity.
It's a localized power surge that spreads and just overwhelms the whole grid.
A localized power surge that overrides all those carefully modulated chemical gaps we talked about. It can cause a total loss of consciousness and violent, involuntary muscle contractions.
And the frustration with epilepsy is that while it can sometimes be traced to an old injury, or maybe an infection or a tumor, often the trigger for that electrical storm is completely unknown.
Right. The doctors just can't pinpoint the cause.
There is no outright cure. But modern medicine can act as a sort of surge protector to prevent the seizures. And surprisingly, the nervous system is dynamic enough that children with epilepsy sometimes just outgrow it as their neural pathways mature.
It's amazing how adaptable the young brain is. But as we age, the vulnerabilities shift. Let's look at the devastating contrast between two major diseases that affect older adults: strokes and Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, yeah.
These two perfectly illustrate different mechanisms of systemic failure. A stroke represents a sudden, catastrophic structural failure. It happens when a blood clot physically blocks the blood flow to a specific part of the brain.
And the mechanism there is just brutal because neurons are incredibly greedy cells. They don't store up their own energy or oxygen reserves like muscle cells do. They live hand to mouth.
Very demanding cells.
So the second that blood clot cuts off the supply line, those cells begin to starve and die almost immediately.
And that rapid cell death permanently severs the fiber optic cables in that region. Depending on which cables are cut, the result is the sudden loss of normal mental functions or paralysis, the inability to feel or move certain parts of the body.
And time is really the only defense there.
It's a race against the clock. If medical treatment can dissolve that clot and restore blood flow fast enough, some of the peripheral damage can be reversed before the cells completely starve.
Contrast that sudden severing with Alzheimer's disease, which is a terrifyingly slow degradation. In Alzheimer's, a person gradually loses their normal mental functions. We're talking about deepening memory loss, severe confusion, and radical mood swings.
Right. And if we look at the physical mechanism, it's not a sudden clot. It is associated with abnormal physical changes inside the brain architecture itself.
What kind of changes?
Well, think back to those microscopic gaps, the synapses, where the chemical ferries cross. In Alzheimer's, abnormal proteins physically gunk up those pathways.
Like plaque on a highway.
Exactly. The neurons degrade, the chemical ferries literally can't dock, and the network just disintegrates from the inside out over years.
And unlike a stroke where immediate intervention can sometimes flush the system, there is no known cure for Alzheimer's. The medicines we have right now can only try to preserve the existing network and sort of slow the progression.
It is a devastating internal reality, but that delicate chemical balance isn't just vulnerable to internal diseases. We can physically shatter it from the outside.
Right? External impacts. The fragile armor. We walk around relying on our skeletal bones to protect this squishy, vital server tower. Let's look at what happens when that physical armor fails, starting with brain injuries.
Brain trauma is so common.
A concussion is the most common, right? And it's often dismissed. People say, oh, it's just a bruise on the brain, shake it off. But a bruise on your arm and a bruise on your brain are fundamentally different things.
Extremely different. Your brain is essentially soft tissue floating in a shallow pool of cerebrospinal fluid, and it's surrounded by sharp, rigid bone.
So when you hit your head,
When you experience a sudden kinetic impact like a car crash or a hard tackle in football, your skull stops moving, but your brain keeps going. It literally sloshes forward and smashes against the inside of the skull.
ouch, and that sloshing creates immense shearing forces. It stretches and tears those microscopic fiber optic cables. It physically disrupts the synapses.
Right. That structural disruption is what causes the immediate severe headaches, dizziness, and confusion. Now, the brain is resilient. A mild concussion will usually heal in a few days or weeks as the tissue repairs those connections.
But the sources issue a very severe warning regarding repeated trauma.
Yes, because you aren't just bruising it, you are permanently altering the architecture. Repeated concussions lead to permanent physical and chemical changes in those neural pathways.
It's cumulative damage.
Exactly. And of course, a severe enough single impact bypasses the concussion phase entirely and just causes immediate permanent brain damage.
And if we connect this to the broader context, we have to look down the spine. The spinal cord is just as vulnerable to kinetic trauma. Remember, it's the main highway carrying the motor division's commands down to the muscles.
Yes, the trunk cable.
When a severe spinal cord injury occurs, that physical highway is crushed or severed.
And because it's severed, the electrical impulses from the brain are still firing, but they hit a literal dead end. The road is washed out. They can't jump the gap, which means the signal never reaches the muscles.
That is the mechanical reality of paralysis. The muscles might be perfectly healthy, the brain might be fully conscious, but the bridge is gone.
It's heartbreaking. While some partial injuries can see recovery, a completely severed cord often means permanent, lifelong paralysis.
It makes you realize how utterly reckless we can be. The kinetic energy in a bike crash or a car accident is vastly superior to the structural integrity of our bone vault.
Oh, without a doubt.
This is why risk mitigation isn't just safety propaganda. A bike helmet works by absorbing and dissipating that kinetic energy before it reaches the skull. It's wild to think that an inch of specialized foam is literally the only thing shifting the physics away from permanent brain damage.
It's a cheap insurance policy for your brain.
Exactly. Wearing seatbelts, avoiding stunts, not diving into shallow water, it's just basic hardware preservation.
Because once that physical network is structurally broken, our biological ability to fix it is incredibly limited.
Okay, we've looked at the baseline anatomy, the internal diseases that degrade it, and the external trauma that smashes it. Now, we need to look at what happens when we voluntarily introduce foreign chemicals into this highly specific electrical chemical grid.
This is a critical piece of the puzzle. When we talk about drugs affecting the nervous system, we use a very broad definition in science. A drug is literally any chemical substance that alters the body or the brain.
So that includes properly prescribed medicines, everyday legal substances, and illegal narcotics. They're all chemical modifiers.
Right. But we really need to zero in on psychoactive drugs.
Psychoactive drugs are specific chemical compounds that cross the blood-brain barrier and fundamentally alter how a person feels, thinks, or acts. They don't just affect the body, they hack the command center.
And they do that by targeting those exact microscopic gaps we talked about earlier, the synapses.
Right, the chemical fairies.
Exactly. These foreign chemicals mimic, block, or flood the natural neurotransmitters. The data categorizes their impact into 3 distinct types based on how they manipulate the central nervous system. First, you have stimulants.
Okay, like caffeine.
Stimulants, like caffeine or cocaine, actively accelerate the central nervous system. They flood the synapses with excitatory chemicals. The neurons fire faster and more frequently, making the user feel highly alert, energetic, and wired.
You are effectively overclocking the processor. But then you have depressants, like alcohol or certain tranquilizers. They do the exact opposite, right? They throttle the system.
They do. Depressants enhance the inhibitory chemicals in the brain. They physically block the receptors from firing, slowing down the entire electrical grid. This makes the user feel relaxed, sluggish, and decreases their reaction times.
And the third category operates on a completely different axis. Hallucinogens like marijuana or LSD. They don't just speed up or slow down the system, they rewrite the data in transit.
That's a really precise way to put it. Hallucinogens mimic the brain's natural serotonin or dopamine, but they send garbage data. They alter how the sensory division processes reality, leading to distorted sensations, false perceptions, and erratic thoughts.
So, if our nervous system is a car engine, or sticking to our network analogy, high-speed server stimulants are an overclocked processor, depressants are a severe bandwidth throttle, and hallucinogens are essentially injecting corrupted code into the interface.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And notice that the categorization ignores legality entirely.
Oh, that's true.
You have legal medicines like antidepressants, everyday legal drugs like caffeine and alcohol, and illegal drugs like cocaine and heroin. The brain doesn't care about the law. It only reacts to the chemical shape of the molecule docking in its receptors.
But regardless of the legal status, there is a brutal mechanical pipeline when these chemicals are misused. It starts with drug abuse, using a substance without medical supervision purely to chase a desirable change in mood. You like the feeling of the overclock, or you like the numbness of the throttle.
But the nervous system is designed for homeostasis. It wants balance. It craves it. When you constantly flood the synapses with foreign chemicals, the brain physically adapts to protect itself. This is the mechanism of tolerance.
You know, I always thought tolerance was just a psychological thing, like getting used to a spicy food.
It's actually not just psychological. It's a physical, structural change. If you constantly flood the receiving neuron with stimulants, the neuron gets overwhelmed. To protect itself, it literally removes some of its own docking stations. It downregulates its receptors.
Wow, so now when you're sober, your brain actually has fewer receptors than a normal person. You physically can't feel normal anymore.
Exactly. And to get that initial high back, you now have to take a vastly larger dose of the drug just to flood the few remaining receptors.
Which defines addiction. You are literally unable to stop because your hardware has been reconfigured to require the drug just to reach a baseline.
And that escalation is what leads directly to overdose.
How does the overdose actually shut everything down?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the autonomic functions we discussed in the motor division. The involuntary commands keeping your heart beating and lungs breathing. An overdose happens when the chemical load completely overwhelms the brainstem.
The truck cable.
Right. A user takes a massive dose of a depressant to overcome their tolerance, and it throttles the system so severely that the brain simply stops sending the electrical impulse to breathe. The system just goes dark.
It is a sobering reality about how vulnerable our hardware truly is. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We have zoomed way in to look at the microscopic chemical fairies crossing synaptic gaps.
We really covered a lot.
We did. We've seen how internal inflammation and gradual physical decay can trap and destroy those pathways. We've looked at the sheer kinetic fragility of the brain and spine, and we've unpacked the mechanical tragedy of chemical tolerance and addiction.
It is a complex, beautiful, and terrifyingly delicate system.
So what does this all mean for you? It means you aren't just a physical machine of levers and pulleys. Everything that makes you you is an ongoing, fragile electrical storm relying on tiny chemical ferries.
Yep, it demands active protection.
Whether that's wearing a helmet to dissipate kinetic energy, recognizing the specific rigid neck of an internal infection like meningitis, or just respecting the terrifying adaptability of your neural receptors.
We have to protect the hardware because it is literally the only lens we have to experience the world.
Which leaves us with a deeply unsettling thought to chew on.
Oh boy.
Think about it. If our entire perception of the outside world is gathered by the peripheral network, but we know psychoactive drugs can effortlessly inject corrupted data, and physical diseases can permanently rewrite our memory pathways, how much of our daily reality is just a fragile chemical electrical illusion?
That is heavy.
An illusion that could be instantly and permanently rewritten by a single bumped head or a slight chemical imbalance.
It raises an important question about how we define reality itself. When the hardware changes, reality changes with it.
It really does. Keep that in mind the next time you feel completely grounded. There's an entire vulnerable universe firing away in the dark. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.